The Honourable Member for Nanaimo-Cowichan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak to Bill C-15, and I won't give the full title because I only have 10 minutes, but essentially we're talking about Northwest Territories devolution and changes to the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. I want to acknowledge the work that the member from Western Arctic has done, and I think he's clearly outlined the NDP position on this and has indicated that the NDP is in favour of devolution and support the Northwest Territories in taking over federal responsibilities in the north. As well, the NDP and the member from Western Arctic has acknowledged that the NWT knows best how its resources ought to be used, and ultimate authority should rest with the Northwest Territories. But as you've heard from others, Mr. Speaker, in typical Conservative fashion, what we have is what should have been a straightforward, clean bill, and instead the Conservatives have inserted changes to the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, and that is where the most opposition we've heard from NWT has come. And I'm going to spend my brief time talking about the opposition to the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, and I'm going to refer to it as the MVRMA. My colleague from Victoria has quoted from the article "Devolution Dishonoured" Monday, February 10th, NWT News North. So I'm not going to quote extensively, but I want to start my remarks with this. The article said, "Well, devolution is undeniably good for the NWT. What the GNWT is losing in return, regional input, trust and cooperation, not to mention political integrity, tarnishes the accomplishment." They go on to say regional boards, by all accounts, worked with industry and bolstered public confidence that development was being done to the benefit of the people affected. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think those are critical comments because much has been made about need to improve regulatory management, yet in the testimony that came before committee and other comments that were submitted in written briefs, it appears that the regulatory management under these regional boards was working. And I want to refer to a letter of January 20th to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs from the Tlicho. And in their comments, in their conclusion, they say C-15 will unravel the advances in reconciliation that have been made between Canada and the Tlicho people over the past 2 decades. Canada has failed to recognize the unique constitutional reality in the NWT created by land claims agreements. It cannot legislate in a manner that is inconsistent with these modern treaties. This is not just about consultation. It is about ensuring the legislative choices are constitutionally sound and do not breach constitutionally protected treaty rights or undermine the purpose and intent of our agreement. And so, Mr. Speaker, when we see comments like this, you wonder about the Section 35 analysis that may or may not have been conducted by the government and what that Section 35 analysis might have indicated about potential breach to agreements that have been signed. And I was one of the fortunate people that was in the House when Tlicho agreement was passed in this House, and it was a great day, I would say, for Canadians. But when you continue to see the spirit and intent of these agreements undermined by future legislation, it does raise some concerns about the government's attention to spirit and intent of these agreements. I want to read from the brief that was provided by Alternatives North, Ecology North. It was submitted on January 17th. And I want to read from this because I think it outlines very clearly the concerns with the proposed changes to the MVRMA. They talk about the legislative foundations, and the political and legislative base for the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act is co-management of the NWT's lands and waters through an integrated regional and territorial level system of environmental planning and assessment and regulatory review. This integrated co-management model arises from federal commitments made in the Sato and Cowichan Comprehensive Land Claims Agreement in the early 1990s. The current version of the MVRMA states in its preamble that the Cowichan Comprehensive Land Claim and the Sato Dene and Métis Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement require the establishment of land use planning boards and land and water boards for the settlement areas, regional boards, referred to in those agreements, and the establishment of an environmental impact review board for the Mackenzie Valley, and provide as well for the establishment of land and water board for the area extending beyond those settlement areas. They go on to say that the relationship between the regional land and water boards and the territorial land and water board is clearly articulated in the land claims agreement and in the MVRMA. Section 24.4.6b of the Cowichan Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement 1992 and Section 25.4.6b of the Sato Dene and Métis Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement 1993 and subsequent to the enactment of the MVRMA Section 2243 of the Tlicho Land Claims and Self-Government Agreement 2003, all state that where a territorial board is established that also has jurisdiction within respective settlement areas, the regional boards become panels of the Territorial Land and Water Board, which is how the system currently operates. Now, Mr. Speaker, they go on to indicate in their brief that, in essence, this integrated co-management model, since its legislative inception, has embraced regional planning boards, regional land and water boards, panels, an environment impact review board, and a territorial land and water board through which the regional boards and panels operated. The model also included an adaptive management component through Section 148 of the MVRMA, which calls for an independent environmental audit every 5 years to assess environmental trends and the integrity of the environmental management system. The integrated co-management system founded in land claims agreement legislation in the MVRMA and actualized through public government institutions has operated successfully for over a decade in the Mackenzie Valley to the benefit of all NWT residents. They go on to outline a number of other issues, Mr. Speaker, but I know that my time is short, so I want to touch on a couple of problems that were highlighted in this document. And it's under the section entitled Problematic Amendments to the MVRMA. The first thing that they touch on is the board panel restructuring. First, the proposed amendments to the preamble of the MVRMA is a significant reinterpretation of the Gwich'in and Sahtu land claims agreement, and therefore the Tlicho agreement, in that it drops a key phrase. Instead of stating that these agreements require the establishment of land use planning boards and land and water boards for the settlement area, the added preamble states that the agreements require the establishment of land use planning boards for the settlement areas. Canada has essentially unilaterally reinterpreted the intent and scope of these agreements by reneging on its commitment to regional boards. And this is an important point, Mr. Speaker, because this is the point where people are suggesting that there could be court challenges because of that unilateral attempt to reinterpret these agreements that were signed in good faith by all parties. Secondly, the definition management area in Section 51 of the current Act, which refers to the respective land claim settlement area, is being repealed on page 100. This amendment means that Canada and the MVRMA no longer recognize the distinct nature of settlement areas within the NWT. And of course, we often talk about how important local and regional control is, and this repeals that provision. Thirdly, sections 54 through 57.2 and 58 through 68 of the current Act, which establishes and defines the role of the Gwich'in, Sahtu, and Wakazi land and water boards, are replaced by sections that consolidate land and water management roles and authorities in a centralized Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board. These amendments dislocate land and water management authorities from the respective land claims regions and diminish the sense of ownership and engagement Aboriginal regions currently have in land and water use decision. And fourthly, Mr. Speaker, Section 54.2 of the amended Act establishes an 11-member central board with 1 member each nominated by the concluded land claims regions, 2 members nominated from the unsettled land claims region, 2 members nominated by the territorial government, and 3 members, excluding the chairperson, appointed by the federal minister. It goes on to say that this grants the federal minister the right to unilaterally appoint the chairperson, which is not the current case, where the board members nominate a chairperson for appointment. Section 56 of the amended Act calls for the project panels of 3 members to be determined by the federally appointed chair, which may or may not include a member from the region on which a project is to occur. And, Mr. Speaker, I mean, that very piece in itself, you could have decisions being made for a region without any representation for that region. And that just doesn't seem a logical way to proceed, particularly when this Act is being sold as more control. And finally, one of the concerns raised is that increased ministerial authority. And it says, given the MVRMA amendments are contained in Bill C-15, which has been put forward as a bill to implement the devolution of land and water management authorities to the GNWT, it is baffling how certain sections of Part 4 of Bill C-15 result in increased authority for the federal government at the cost of territorial and Aboriginal government authority and or the authority of northern boards. This appears to be devolution in name only, but not in practice. And, Mr. Speaker, I think that's probably a good place to conclude. So, although, as the member from Western Arctic has rightly pointed out, New Democrats support devolution, the MVRMA undermines that process by taking away the regional responsibilities that have been working well over the last decade. So, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister of State for Fednor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in my first opportunity to debate through you to this member, I want to take this opportunity to appreciate what she brings to the Aboriginal Affairs Standing Committee. I had an opportunity over the past couple of years to be a part of that committee, and I appreciate the important work she's done, and as well to the member from the Western Arctic, despite some rather profound disagreements. My question for her today is that earlier we heard the Leader of the Opposition suggest that regulatory improvement is holding devolution hostage. Now, I find that difficult to believe. I'm sure that the member for Nanaimo-Cowichan was present during the hearings in Yellowknife where she heard the Premier say, and I quote, "We need an efficient and effective regulatory system in the Northwest Territories that protects the public interest, allows us to manage our land and environment, and promotes responsible development." Now my money is on the Premier's words, but I was wondering if the member could reconcile these comments or clarify what on earth her leader is saying when he says regulatory improvement is holding devolution hostage.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo-Cowichan.
Well, I want to thank the member, the minister, for those kind remarks with regards to our working relationship. And I have to say that sadly I was not in Yellowknife because I was fogged in on Vancouver Island. However, I have reviewed the testimony and the briefing notes from those days. With regards to, we've got, the problem with this piece of legislation is that we've got two pieces of legislation combined in one that should never have been brought together. We've got the Northwest Territory devolution, which is broadly supported. I mean, there may be some minor changes that are required, but it's broadly supported. And then what we've got is wholesale change to the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act that is not broadly supported, hasn't had the kind of consultative process that should have been put in place for a process that's going to impact on self-government and land claims agreements. And if there are regulatory changes that are required, that should have been a very broad consultative process. So when our leader talked about the fact that Northwest Territories devolution is being held hostage to regulatory management, he's absolutely correct. Our understanding is that people were told, well, if you want devolution and you want it to happen now, you have to accept these regulatory changes. That doesn't seem like a fair and honourable way to bring forward significant changes to the territory.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Labrador.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know that the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act was put in place to, I guess, set a mandate for existing land claims in the Northwest Territories. And when we listened to many of the presentations that were given us, this was outlined time and time again. It was supposed to be a true co-management regime that in the Northwest Territories that was negotiated between Aboriginal governments and non-Aboriginal governments. These Aboriginal governments today feel that the federal system is imposing up on them and up on that agreement. And I asked my colleague today, what will be the impact of government's ignorance to their claims and to what they're saying today if this is not amended?
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo-Cowichan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member from Labrador for that very important question. Of course, in my speech, I talked about the spirit and intent of land claims agreements and self-government agreements and treaties. And this proposal to move forward without the appropriate consultation undermines the spirit and intent of the treaties. And I want to just turn for a minute to the Katludeche First Nation, and they made a general statement, and there's 2 points that they made in their statement I wanted to touch on. It says that they have concerns about the changes to the MVRMA. One of them is the dismantling of the regional land and water boards, and the other is the increased ministerial authority. Now, of course, the spirit and intent of comprehensive land claims and self-government agreements is to rest the authority for decision-making with the nation with whom that land claims or comprehensive self-government agreement was negotiated. And here we've got increased ministerial authority, which seems to undermine that whole process of devolving authority to the rightly appointed people.